Welcome to the second in 3 videos that walk through a mock paper for the AQA Germany Democracy and Dictatorship Unit. In this video, we will focus on 2 questions, the 4-mark Describe question and the 8-mark Social Impact question. Question 4 on this paper is a 4-mark question that asks you to describe 2 things, usually problems, that either the German government or the German people faced at a point in time. This question reads: describe 2 problems facing Jews living in Germany during the years 1933 and 1939. Remember, it is only worth 4 marks, and it is asking you to describe the problems, in other words, give factual detail about the problem, rather than a full explanation. You also need to pay particular attention to the date range in the question, sometimes this can be very narrow. You now have 1 minute to identify 2 problems for Jews living in Germany from 1933 to 1939. I have chosen to identify segregation and violence as 2 key themes. As soon as the Nazis came to power, they passed laws to segregate Jews from public life, and this resulted in their social alienation. By the end of the 30s, they also faced acts of violence that made them fear for their lives. Note that I have not mentioned the ghettos or concentration camps. These were part of the Holocaust, which did not start in earnest until the outbreak of war in 1939. Before then, there was a gradual curtailment of Jewish rights that dehumanized them and set the scene for the greater atrocities. This is my response. Note that both paragraphs are shorter than a paragraph for an 8-mark question that requires explanation. You would gain half marks for simply identifying 2 problems, so do not spend any longer than 5 minutes describing the problem. The first problem was discrimination and segregation from German society. Jews had to wear the yellow Star of David and were not allowed in public areas, such as cinemas and public swimming pools. Secondly, by the late 1930s, they also feared for their lives due to regular mob violence against Jewish communities. The most famous of these outbursts took place in November 1938, during Kristallnacht, when Jewish shops were destroyed, synagogues attacked, and Jews were assaulted. Let's now examine the 8-mark Social Impact question. For this question, you need to write 2 paragraphs, both with distinct reasons that address the question. The question begins with the phrase, "In what ways were the lives of the German people affected by?" This requires you to consider the social impact of a political or economic event. In other words, how do the events you learn about in the Germany course affect ordinary German people? For the higher marks, you need to write 2 paragraphs and try to consider 2 social groups in your answer. In other words, you could discuss the impact of a policy on the workers first, and then on women, or the elderly, or the youth. The question I am asking you to consider today is: in what ways were the lives of the German people affected by events during the Kaiser years, 1890 to 1918? This question covers an 28-year time span. You would not be asked about such a large time span in the real exam. Therefore, let's break this question into 2. Firstly, Examine the Kaiser years before the outbreak of World War I in 1914. You have 1 minute to consider which events impacted the German people before 1914. How would they have been impacted? I can think of 3 key events. The first is Weltpolitik, or world policy, which was when the Kaiser invested heavily in the navy in order to gain overseas colonies, especially in Africa. Linked to this is the arms race between Britain and Germany, which also cost an extortionate amount of money. This led to an increase in patriotism, as people felt pride in the achievements of their nation. The third is not really an event, but rather a phenomenon: rapid industrialization, in other words the growth of industry especially in northern cities like Berlin, Düsseldorf and Cologne. This led to a growth in the urban population, and a sudden drop in living standards. For my paragraph that explores events before World War I have written, before World War I, ordinary German people were affected by the Kaiser's bad policymaking. For example, the Kaiser spent too much money on Weltpolitik, which was his conquest of overseas colonies. In order to achieve this, the Kaiser spent a huge amount of battleships to defend his colonies. This meant that there was less government money to support ordinary people, many of whom lived in squalid conditions in large industrial cities. Therefore, the Kaiser did not know what the ordinary people needed, and the workers continued to suffer, so that he could compete with Britain in an arms race. This paragraph pinpoints a specific policy of the Kaiser, and then links it to the decline in quality of life for the ordinary people. By doing this, you are showing the social impact of political events. I have also pinpointed the effect the event has on a specific social group, in this case, those living in the city, to show how some events can impact one group worse than others. This is important to gain the higher marks in this type of question. Now spend a minute consider which events impacted the German people from 1914 and 1918, and how this would have impacted them. You can break World War I into 3 key events. Firstly, the outbreak of World War I, when there was high levels of optimism that there would be a swift victory by Christmas. Secondly, the turnip winter of 1916 to 1917, which was exacerbated by the British naval blockade, which resulted in mass starvation and a rise in disease. Finally, there is the German defeat in November 1918, which saw a sudden decline in morale and the German people turning against the Kaiser, who in turn was forced to abdicate. For this paragraph on events during World War I have written, during World War I, quality of life for German citizens deteriorated. Women were told to work in the weapon factories. This made life harder, because they also had to care for their children. Furthermore, since Germany lost the naval race against Britain, they faced a blockade, so could not import food. This led to food shortages, especially during the turnip winter of 1916-17, leading to malnutrition and lower worker productivity. As a result, the German citizens started to riot in protest, which contributed to the Kaiser's abdication. This paragraph pinpoints a different social group, and how their lives were affected: the women who stayed at home while the soldiers were at war. It also links economic deprivation, the food shortages, with civil unrest, showing how when times get tough the people tend to get angry, and if this anger is not abated then it can turn to violence. Thank you for watching. Tune into the final lecture in this short series for a walkthrough to a 12-mark bullet point style question.